everyone. Today did not start on the right page there. I don't know what happened with that, but today we are looking at women in art in the medieval period. Specifically with this ended up being just on illuminated manuscripts, just because of the length. I'm trying not to have it be as long as the other one, so we're looking at specifically in the medieval period illuminated manuscripts. And here are the topics. So I'll let you look through those if you want to for that, but we're going to move on ahead. So now we get to this slide, which is looking at the basics of the creation of illuminated manuscripts, how they are made, what do you do with them. There are a ton of different steps to that. So even in the name, if we just look at the name, illuminated manuscripts comes from the Latin words manus, which means hand, and then scriptus, which means writing, right? So that what it ultimately is it literally means written by hand, which it was. There's no printing press yet. One of the things that when the printing press comes, it's actually interesting in the sense that the printing press, there's this period where the printing press is used for the text part of the book, and the illustrations are still done by hand. And so you get this combo of hand painted, drawn images and printed text. Then there's a period where they have printed text and images, and then they hand paint or color them in, but they didn't draw it like it was made up once to go through the printing press, and then that way you can print multiple copies, and then they were just people that hand color them, and then eventually color, so that none of that was done by hand. So when it transitions from like the handwritten illuminated manuscripts, it's fully by hand, but technically even with the early printing press, some books, not all, some were just the text, but ones that were the kind of the fancier, more expensive books that were still trying to imitate and copy the illuminated manuscript style, and so there were still aspects that were done by hand. But obviously this comes from that. And then illuminated comes from the Latin word illuminare, which means lightened up. Put that one right here. Lightened up, which is lightened up through the paintings, right? The images and stuff. And specifically like the paintings and the gold leaf. The gold leaf is a huge part of these kind of illuminated manuscripts. So we'll go over that and stuff on how that's structured. So these books were super expensive. Okay, here, very expensive. And that meant that, of course, I mean, that's one of the benefits of the printing press is it made books cheap or cheaper and eventually cheap, so that the masses could have access to books. But at this point in time, because of how expensive the whole thing was, because it is a massive process, this was largely regulated to royalty, nobility, and the church. Right? They're the ones that could afford to commission, be patrons of, have the time and people to produce the manuscripts. And by and large, for sure, the main topic of illuminated manuscripts was connected to the church with religious scripture, and that stays was scripture / prayer books / hymns, right? We're all part of that. But you also had science books, mythology, and as time went on, other texts, which could really range from whatever the person that was wealthy enough to commission it wanted it to be on. But certainly because the church was such a huge role with the monks and convents, with the nuns making these books, they by a lot had a religious focus to them. Okay, but just to be clear though, there definitely were books that were not religious; they were secular in topic, as well. Just not the ratio was much higher towards the church because of that structure. So the first step in doing this was preparing the parchment. Right, you needed the paper or parchment to write and create the book. So I mean that's and parchment comes from animal skin. So there was of course the aspect of skinning the animal, and then once you did that, you had to stretch and scrape the parchment, and this would slowly keep being spread out, and then cut the parchment. So this in itself took a lot of time. You think of some of these books are pretty thick. That's a lot of pages, and that meant that was a lot of parchment to prepare for that. Now, within the church with the monks and nuns who were doing a lot of these, they wouldn't just buy parchment for a single book. They'd have stuff on hand. But it's still the first part was just getting the paper was a process in itself. And then of course you had to prepare the ink, mix the ink and paint. So, and prepare the stylus, which was done with a feather. And you would take these larger feathers that were thick enough, and you actually usually had different like thicknesses of feather, so it wasn't just one type. And then you would kind of put hot sand over it to help with so it didn't crack and split when you cut into it. And then you would cut into it and shape it like a calligraphy pen. Modern day calligraphy pens where you don't have to make them yourself. Well, the quill, right, was the early stylus. Eventually the stylus is going to shift to metal and wooden handles, but the earliest styluses were the quills, which had to be crafted for that. And usually different scribes had different preferences for the type of quill that they used, and that's why you usually cut your own a lot of the time, so you could do it the way that you wanted to. And of course these did lose their, let's say, sharpness over time, right? The tips would fray or dull, and so then you'd have to have a new one that you'd use in that. So there's all of that preparation just in and of itself, right? And then you had, and those could be several different people. The people making the parchment were not the ones that were making the manuscript. You often had those that were learning the trade that would help prepare the inks, the paints. If they were good at preparing the quills and knew what the person liked, they could do those too. And then you had a scribe, right, which was for the text. And then you had like the illuminator or illustrator, right, that did the paintings and the gold leaf. Women tended to be initially the illuminators. So the women, when in the earliest period of the illuminated manuscripts, women tended to be the ones that did the paintings. Later in the medieval period, you have more and more women that also come out as scribes as well, or just as scribes and not as illuminators. But in the earliest period, like I said, women were largely regulated to the illuminations, not the written text, but that does change over time to where you do have some women who were scribes. But even in the later periods, when you do have women as scribes, then the majority were still illuminators over scribes. So for when we do have women like Christine de Pizan that was a scribe and just directed the illuminations, right, that was more unique. And because that even if women were literate and which the women that were doing all these were. But even if you were well educated and was good at writing, that was just typically more given to men to do most of the time. And so it really were these certain women that kind of stood out in their skill to create. And then there's different types of scribes, and I'll talk more about that a little later. But the women, when they were scribes in the earlier period, were usually seen as copiers, what would be the word for copy, typist? No, I don't know what the journalistic term for it is, but women copied text, right? There was kind of this expectation that men were the ones that created text, women were the ones that copied it. So early scribes that were women tended to be the ones that were just copying an older manuscript or scroll. So one of the reasons we have a lot of ancient texts is actually from these convents and monasteries that copied and preserved older texts that were starting to deteriorate or were only in like scroll form, and they added a lot to it. So we certainly owe a debt, I think, to all that preservation that took place, that otherwise those texts probably would have been lost. So the copying and copying basically an already written text was extremely important. It was also a good way to learn, and women over time, again, did eventually start writing their own works as well. But it was more common for women, if they were scribes initially, to copy the text. And then you had so you're not done, right? There's still another step, which is the binding and decorations. Final manuscripts were bound with leather covers, and the more basic ones, and clasp. And actually, before you even do the binding, you had to sew the book together, right? So you had to get them in the different sections and sew that, and put all the parchment pages together, and sew that. And then you would have the cover, right? And the cover was usually wood that then was covered with leather, or could be metals and jewels. And then you always had a clasp as well, because the books usually were large. Most of the illuminated manuscripts were pretty large. So if you didn't have a clasp like closing it and holding the binding together, it would always like kind of be partially open. So the clasp kept everything compressed. And so it was a necessity to have the clasp so the book stayed closed. And then the really elaborate books that were either paid by extremely wealthy patrons or the church would have could be covered in gold. I mean, you can see this one here. It has gold and jewels, and like a small little figurine on the top there, that a small relief, and that was so that type of kind of like relief carving or mold made from the whatever metal they were using. You could do it in leather too sometimes, but more often than not, you saw these like with anything that had like larger reliefs and jewels and other pieces and precious metals were the not had any leather that was left on it, essentially. And so even the binding itself, the cover, well, not the binding, the cover could be very time consuming and an artwork in of itself, and very expensive, right? So those that were extremely wealthy could show off their wealth through having an illuminated the nobility just showed off their wealth by having illuminated manuscripts. And there were many women that actually had these kind of larger book collections that were gifted to them, that they inherited and things like that. So just having illuminated manuscripts was showing off your wealth. Even the like cheapest made manuscript at this time was expensive and would show off your wealth. But if you were extremely wealthy, or again, if you were like a king or the church, then you could extend that to expand beyond just, well, I have a bunch of books that are expensive as is, to this cover of this book is as expensive as 3 regular illuminated manuscripts, right? So that's the kind of process for just the pieces that you needed to create the illuminated manuscript. And then there were aspects or key components of the manuscripts that tended to be consistent. Now, of course, if someone commissioned something a certain way, some books occasionally, varied or deviated from the kind of norm and standards of those books. But there are these characteristics that tend to be consistent. One is that borders, elaborate border designs was very common. Usually in floral or geometric patterns, and the borders of the page were usually, you had borders in two ways. So you could have a page with text and illustrations, and then you'd have a border around that. Or you could have a page that's just the illustration, the painting, and that could have a border around it. And the borders were a way to show off skill and detail, and also just filled out the page and made it, so many more hours of work every time you did an elaborate border around the page. And then you also had illuminated letters, which you can see here in this one. And illuminated letters all usually were the large decorative capital letters and that started at each section. Sometimes, so there were a couple different ways to do this. One was it would start just be the first letter of the page, and then that would be it. Others did like each paragraph or section, right? Then that first letter, that was the capital letter, would be illuminated. And then the illuminated letters could also be just a simple design, so that the letter is just elaborated, but there's no picture. Or it could be like the one that we see here. You have the illuminated S, right, that has its stylized aspects. And then inside the S, you have a miniature, right, a painting in itself. And these usually almost always were related to the text. If there was a picture, if it was just the letter that was like flourished with like whatever design that you wanted to do, that didn't like necessarily have anything like, there wasn't like, just because you did a geometric shaped background around the illuminated letter that meant anything towards the text. But the instant that there was the miniature paintings in the letters, or letters that were shaped to be part of the picture. So in this case here, in this picture, you have the S, and then like the the pictures like in the background mostly, except for the woman that's in the front of the S. Everyone else is in the background of it. It's not, the S itself is separate, even though it's like nicely intertwined, so it all looks like it goes together, right? If you remove the picture from this example, you'd still have an illuminated S. So hopefully that makes sense. You'd still have the illuminated S if you took away the miniature picture from the example I was showing. But there were some where the letter was shaped and made into the painting or picture itself. So it could be either one of those. And in that case, like, you couldn't remove the letter without, or you couldn't remove the picture, the painting, without removing the letter. And so it just varied. It was usually, an artistic artist decision on their style and what they wanted to do. Or again, if it's commissioned, and the people, the patrons and women were active patrons of illuminated manuscripts. One of the reasons I think that they liked being patrons was, one, again, it showed off their wealth, but two, they had complete control over the process, what the topics that they wanted to be included in their manuscript, the style, stylized text, the style of illumination, the type of paintings. All of this was quite powerful, and being able to have like an authoritative control over the entire process. Now, not everyone did. Some patrons just said, I want a manuscript on this, right? And then it was left to the scribe and the illuminator to make it as they saw fit. Other patrons liked having the control and were very hands-on in what specific images and designs and type of text and all of that was established. And so both were present, and it kind of just depended on who was commissioning the work essentially for that, on what type you got. And then you have, of course, the paintings themselves, both in the illuminated letter, but then you also had separate pages that were included that painted illustrations. So here we can see this is like a hymn. It's like music. It's a music sheet. And so the illuminated letter is within that text. But on the page like next to it, there could have been a whole illuminated painting, illustration that was connected to whatever, in this case, the song was about, right? Or the story was about. And that you would do is they would sketch it out first with a lead pencil or lead stylus, or the lines with the back of the knife. But you would sketch out. None of the artists were just like freehanding this stuff, right? They would sketch it out with a really light lead, and then once they had the sketch done the way they wanted, then they would paint, right, the light colors. Then you would have the gold leaf be added, which was a process in itself, and then the darker colors and accents. So again, a massive undertaking and project to have this all be created. And then there's still one more step, which is the text as well. And the text was again done by the scribes, the paintings by the illustrators, but the text also was seen as a form of art and important. Like the paintings, you prepared. You didn't just start writing, because I imagine if they had just started writing on it, like, oh, I'll just wing it. We would have had a lot of illuminated manuscripts that were like, you try writing without lines and your writing gets slanted. You should probably end up with a lot of manuscripts that ended up being slanted if they didn't plan this out meticulously. So to avoid the awkward slanted writing, they also prepared things with a stylus or pencil, or use the back of a knife to create near invisible lines guiding the text. Essentially, these are guiding line text. Now, in this example, you can actually see the remnants in the corner of one. Sometimes they didn't. You actually see it right here too, where the lines end for the lines for the music notes and stuff. So they didn't, near invisible. Sometimes they were there. Sometimes they would erase them. Sometimes they just, you painted over them so you didn't see it. But that was, and it varied between whether it was with the lead pencil or stylus, or again, basically a small mark with the back of the knife. The benefit of parchment is if you messed up once you were painting, so not painting, well, painting or for the scribe. So when they're writing a word, if they mess up, because it's thick, because of it being animal skin, you can scratch out, essentially carve out, it's just light scratching, but you scratch out the mistake and then let it dry completely and be fully prepared, and then you can paint over it, and it's almost not noticeable unless you were like inspecting it super close up. So that's how scribes dealt with like mistakes too. But all this was planned out. So before the paintings, before the writing, they would do the guidelines. There would be spaces marked clearly that were left available for the like illuminated letters. And so, I mean, even here with this one that we're still looking at here, the illuminated letter, that provided that structure. Here you can see other lines too, right? So here you've got the lines that got left on, and they didn't always get rid of them. They didn't usually go over in ink, but it just depended on the aesthetics that they were going for and stuff like that. But all of this would be planned out, the margins, where the text was going to end, spaces for, right, the person with the leaves here, spaces for these little designs. Also, these little designs that are at the with the words here, those also were also great for covering up a mistake. So that also provided. However, you had to be careful because again, there were definitely some early periods where and some scribes that were more kind of go with the flow, and once they did the guidelines, they just kind of wrote it out. But obviously, if you didn't scratch out and instead tried to cover a mistake, you had to make sure you still had space for the whatever the piece of text was that was planned for that page. So the thing about it, like having to do all this preparation and guiding text layout required a lot of pre-planning for for individual pages, but then two, for the text as a whole. Because if you wanted to make sure that you didn't end the partway through a paragraph, essentially. There were some times where they did, but the goal was to like have, that things ended in a way that looked natural, not like a continuation onto the next page like books just do today. And no one thinks that as an issue, because again, the artwork was to go with the content of the text. And if you're part of that idea was on a different page, then it had less meaning by some, depending on again what was on the next page, but it potentially could have less meaning. And then ultimately it's all just kind of looks like it wasn't thought about or planned. The other thing besides the layout and all of that they had to do, and then of course the writing, the text itself, and we can see here it's super precise. So this was not a fast writing process, right? It was a slow writing process. They were not writing out words quickly. They took their time with each word to make sure that it looked like the same style. And that's the other part. There was then the decision for the type of script style, which often was reflected in local customs and tastes that influenced the style, the size, and overall page design, or the individual scribe's style, or again, the patron, if they were commissioning it, could request specific style of text. And there were, they had like collections of just styles of text, like the typist's style. I have an old book that was printed, not obviously hand done, but it's an older book of text types and styles, and they even have in it like some of the ones that look like the illuminated manuscript style, but obviously from the printing press. Now you can just go on computer and you can select your style of text, but they would actually create these collections of these different styles so that scribes could look through and see like what style did they want to use, and then make sure that that's what they did. And then of course the detail, though, again, to just keep it consistent was, I mean, a lot in itself. Everything was done intentionally, carefully, methodically, right? Scribes copied the text slowly and methodically because you wanted it to look uniform. You wanted it to look like it was intentional, the whole aspect of it. You wanted the text style and the size and the structure to look consistent throughout. And so that meant that, again, that very careful planning, that very careful structure. Okay, so that's the structure and layout of illuminated manuscripts. Again, so many components to it. It was each piece required a lot of talent and skill and work to then be finally put together to complete the total project of it. So we're going to look now specifically at women's involvement, and I mentioned a few things with it, but we're going to look at women's involvement in it. And women were both creators and consumers of illuminated manuscripts. Prior to the end of the 13th century, books were almost exclusively made in monasteries and convents, so by monks and nuns, obviously connected to the church, right? And so that meant that the role of the convents or nunneries were super important, well, the monasteries too, in creating these illuminated manuscripts. For women, that meant that the women who were in the early years creating illuminated manuscripts were connected to some convent. They had what was like this essentially double not convent, but like the religious order in the early years. If you had a monastery, you always had a convent with it as well. And this was beneficial because it meant that women were immediately included within the church in a particular way. There was a ton of limitations on women in the church by this point, but that was one area where women were then still part of the church. Later, they're going to get rid of that so that the nunneries are not automatically part of the kind of internal church order anymore. They're their own separate thing, which not only further pushed women out of the church, but did create limitations on women working on illuminated manuscripts because, again, a lot of funding came from the church to produce these. And so you had less emphasis on that job if you were not part of it. But in the early years, women and monasteries and the convents were like a pair. They kind of came together. They were part of the church structure. And what's interesting is with the nunneries, this was largely connected to upper class women. So, I think people think today, like people going to become a nun are not from the wealthy class. But in fact, the only way you could be part of the nunnery was to be from the upper class because it required a dowry to get in. So a dowry is what a family, the father and mother give to their daughter that she takes into the marriage. The dowries, so there's dowries can be abused, right? So I think that's important to point out is they can be abused. So it can be where like it feels like they're paying the future husband to take their daughter. But the purpose of dowries from Mesopotamia onward was what the intent was when it wasn't being abused was actually to provide protection for their daughters when they went into this marriage by giving a dowry that was large enough that even if their husband died suddenly or was a deadbeat or divorced their wife and left, because in a lot of places and especially at this period in Europe, husbands could pretty much just divorce and ditch their wives and leave them with nothing. Women were not the ones who got custody of their kids. They could kind of be left destitute. But the legal aspect of the dowry was that the value of the dowry could not be touched by the husband, and then that would be something that the women would get back if, again, they're get back or have control of. Like, say if you were widowed, right? Well, even if women couldn't always inherit from their husbands even. Some places you could, some places you couldn't. It totally depends on the region and location. But some places women couldn't inherit, and that would go to like any sons or other male heirs to continue the noble name. And then, so if let's say you were married, you had a daughter, but you didn't have a son, your husband dies, the majority of the estate would actually go to the next male relative because that way it kept the name and the male family line in the estate. Some places, if there was no male heir, then the wife and or daughter could inherit. And then in a few places, wives could inherit, and daughters could inherit no matter what the circumstance. That was more rare though. So the idea was a dowry was a protection. You wanted your daughter you didn't want to have your daughter, you're a nobility. you want your daughter to make sure that she always has that status and that ability to do that, or at least for a particular time. And so you give that dowry as a way to protect her in these various circumstances, because that money, the wealth, it wasn't just straight money, it was like movable goods. So that could be like furniture, jewelry, it could be money, it could, it could be a ton of different things, but it was usually movable property, right? The land and that type of thing was always with the husband. The movable property was women. But the idea is they bring that into the marriage, and a lot of times the dowry was stuff that like helped you start a household, but at the same time had specific value to it. So the idea was, again, that was the wife always got to control that dowry, and then she could give the dowry to her daughter, even if there was no other inheritance rules for women. So the point being, it was meant to be a protection. And so in part to fund the nunneries, or the convents, the expectation was that women becoming nuns their dowry that they would have, because they're not going to get married. If they're becoming a nun, they're not getting married. So the dowry that would have gone to them into the marriage now is going into the convent, right? And it helps support and finance different things that the convents did, but it was a requirement for it. The benefit of women in this period of time, again, and being specific, this period of time, because the benefits of being a nun change over time. But in this early period of time, being a nun provided a socially acceptable way for women who didn't want to get married. So that's one thing. There wasn't really a socially acceptable thing to say, I'm just going to be a bachelor and I'm not going to get married. That was very frowned upon. But if you went and became a nun, then it was accepted and it was okay. It also gave women a lot of independence from much of male authority in not just religious life, but just in general. So women ended up having quite a bit of independence and autonomy as nuns, which sounds counterintuitive, I think, to how we think of nun, someone that's a nun in more recent periods in time. But it really was a way that could happen. You also could continue education, and then of course the illuminated manuscripts were also done by nuns. And if you really liked learning, working on illuminated manuscripts was a brilliant way to have access to all of these old texts that you were copying and creating or illustrating, and really opened up opportunities and options for women at that time. What it allowed is women to exercise the leadership skills, and because what they would do in nunneries is they would manage estates within the convents, preserve culture and learning through land holdings, working and training as painters, being educated. It was kind of a good deal. In fact, it wasn't just for women who were never married. There were women who, after they were widowed, would retire to the nunnery. And there were different levels. Like you could be not a nun, but you're paying like your money to stay there, and that's your retirement. You could become a nun later in life if you didn't have a living husband. So many women found it as a way to avoid those kind of social expectations and structures that otherwise had. And so here we see in one of the illuminated manuscripts in the illustrations, we have a woman who is working on a book in what appears to be as a scribe. And then you have like the gold leaf and the border. And you can tell with her clothing that we'll see, like when we look at Christine de Pizan before she retires to a convent, she has on like the more elaborate dress style of nobility. But here, this is a very basic garment. She has kind of like a head covering or veil that's not elaborate, right? That was one thing of being part of the convent, is that you didn't dress in elaborate clothes. You had much more simplistic clothes that you wore, because the nunneries were still focused on this idea of not being poor, but not having excess, not being ostentatious about wealth and that type of thing. And so the women wore much more simplistic garb than what their status, if they were out in the real world, secular world, what clothing they would wear as nobility would be very, very different from what they wore in as a nun. But you can see here that she has the raised desk and is writing with that quill into a book, and looking very studious. So we have several examples in illuminated manuscripts showing women active as again scribes and illustrators. Go down here with this. The first major convent bookmaking workshop emerged during the reign of Charlemagne. So this is like there were other convents that were doing illuminated manuscripts, but like having an actual bookmaking workshop where it was like a whole process happened during the reign of Charlemagne. And their whole thing was on manuscript creation and preservation. And so it was this huge kind of process. His sister Gisela directed the first Carolingian convent bookmaking workshop in Paris. And so that was a whole part of women being actively involved in it. And again, we saw several examples of women being shown in some of the illuminated manuscripts from this. And so this one here is Guda. She put herself in there. Clarissa painted herself swinging from the body of the initial Q. So it's really clever too, because they you didn't usually sign your name into illuminated manuscripts. There are a few, like again, Christine de Pizan, who was super famous. She put herself in the books all over the place, and you knew she was the author because she referenced herself. But that's like the super celebrity level. The average woman working on illuminated manuscripts did not put her name in as an author or as a copyist or as an illustrator, but women still found the ways to put themselves into the book in subtle ways that highlighted their role, which is like the example here, that within the illuminated letter, it's generic enough to be just a woman that fits with whatever the text was saying, but subtle clues give away, and her name is in there, but it's small, so it's very clever. So one of the things you can do is this, essentially the idea of it looks like just a border or a line, but it's made out of words, and the writing is small enough, and then there's writing that continues around the D. So it looks like if you're just glancing, it looks like design, but then it actually has her name if you look closely in it. But at the same time, again, it looks like it could just be a generic woman, a picture of a woman that we went with the text. But then there's those signs that tell us that was actually that she was the illustrator and that she put herself in. So they usually, most of the time, it was subtle ways that women put themselves in to kind of announce themselves as the illustrators without directly having, like in the title page, illustrated by. They didn't do that. And so this was the most common way was to throw yourself into one of the miniatures of the illuminated letters, because it was small, because it was more forgettable. They instead of putting yourself like on a whole page illustration, you just snuck yourself or your name into part of the illuminated letter, and that gives us that clue of women being a part of this process. This is the period where the double monastery went away, right? The one for men and one for women ended, and convents ended up being excluded from the church hierarchy. And as I mentioned, that meant that they lost some of their funding and like kind of internal process of being part of the church and working with having the larger workshops, because they just didn't have the same funds. This led to a period of decline in women being involved in the illuminated manuscripts. And this led to around like the 12th century, women known as the Beguines came together to live in chastity and poverty. Here, I'll put the name. Oops. Nope. Go back to there. You get to see where I was getting the, I don't know why it's not working. All right, hang on, it froze up on me. Just a second. Okay, let's see if I can get this working and not frozen up now. Yeah, okay, good. So the Beguines, they came together and their focus shifted to chastity and poverty and giving to the poor. Right, so you kind of had, because of the end of the double monastery, you had a shift in certain convents that moved away from the illuminated manuscripts for a time. They also renounced all worldly goods. Now, there still were what were considered heretical sects that women were attracted to, because it did offer them those more freedoms and opportunities that the convents used to offer, but those weren't sanctioned by the church in the same way. Despite this and these obstacles that took place, you still end up having a lot of convents end up increasing in numbers. So, for example, the one group that was called the Poor Clares, they started in Italy around 1250, and there were five, and then they started in Italy, and by 1250 there were 500 convents. So they started with only a few, and in a relatively short period of time they ended up with over 500 in Germany. And when it shifted to Germany, this is where you end up getting a lot of female illuminators, like Clarissa, who painted herself on the queue, Guda that we showed here, and this the one I didn't have the one with Clarissa that she painted herself in the queue. So in Guda, she has herself in a nun's habit. Clarissa was actually painted in like regular clothes, so there is some suggestion that she might not have been a nun, but was actually an upper class woman that was sent to the convent for schooling, which was also a common practice. Is that even if they didn't join as nuns, that the one of the benefits of the convents was that they offered essentially higher levels of education for upper class women that they couldn't get in public, if you will. Right? Upper class women were educated, but like universities were shut off from women, and even like higher learning that isn't necessarily university learning, but higher levels of learning and expansion beyond just the basics. You had to either have a tutor come into the home, or again, many sent their daughters to these convents to get that education because they provided that structure and freedom to do so. So we end up with an increase in women illustrators. With the rise of these monasteries, well, not monasteries, that'd be monks, the nunneries, because of the removal of the church. So again, these were kind of seen as not necessarily all church sponsored or sanctioned, is probably the better word for that. They were sometimes deemed heretical, but that didn't stop them from growing, because they were extremely popular with the public. They were extremely popular with the upper class families that wanted to have their daughters be educated there, and they were extremely popular with women who were looking for alternatives to the traditional roles and structure. Oops, I skipped it. Here, go to this one here. That you otherwise were kind of expected to go into. So then we have another well-known woman that was part of working on manuscripts, which was Hildegard. Who became Saint Hildegard of Bingen. So she was the abbess of a convent in Germany, and became super famous in her correspondence, her letters with kings and popes. She was author of poetry, music, plays, medical encyclopedia, and in many ways shaping a lot of the manuscript culture for women. She did not paint the illustrations herself, but she was responsible for the innovative designs. She was actually a scribe. So here you see with that she was a scribe over an illustrator, but again, dictated. She was in charge of for any of the stuff that she wrote, and actually just in the convent because she was an abbess and stuff. She dictated a lot of the style and structure of the illustrators for that. She is shown in this painting in one of the manuscripts, receiving her visions. So you can see that she's got on her slightly more elaborate clothing than just the normal nun, because again, she was kind of one of the heads of the convent. And then she has her tablet and the stylus for writing. And then these red things here that are described as flames but look like tentacles to me are like floating over her head. And the idea was that she had visions from God and she wrote them down. And so that those flames are supposed to be the illuminating light from God giving her her visions, or alien tentacles sucking on her brain or transmitting stuff. It's supposed to be flame, representing the light of God, but I can't look at it without thinking tentacles. So with this, so you actually have this, and then you have a monk that's actually standing looking on at what she is writing. She said that she had gotten these visions from the age of 5, but only started recording the writings at 42 to share God's revelations. And this is significant because, again, women didn't usually create new writings themselves and commentary on religious scripture. They tended to just copy already written works on religious scripture. That was definitely an area that was not typically for women, was like anything with religious scripture. But in this case, she was one of the unique ones that actually wrote her own commentary and information on not just scripture, but then her visions from God. And so again, that was significant in its own right. That, and not just that, but the fact that then she was so well regarded that she wrote to kings and popes about her religious beliefs, about her visions, about her commentary on religious scripture, highlights how valued she was in terms of her intellect and her spiritual connection from that. She ended up being somewhat of a semi-celebrity during this period. And again, was one of the few women that had her own body of work that was original writings, or I suppose writings from the visions from God, but nonetheless not copied from other men or texts, but was her own creations from those texts. And like I said, she's a good example of that, where she didn't follow the traditional structure of women being illustrators, and instead was a scribe. And not just a scribe copying, but a scribe who wrote her own works and commentaries, and then was a prolific writer to very powerful and wealthy men who listened to her and asked for advice, asked her to give her opinion on scripture, on other aspects of life. So impressive in that sense with that. All right, next we're looking at a depiction of women in everyday life in the illuminated manuscripts. So around 1256, a French countess commissioned an illuminated manuscript that was a health manual. She wanted it to share with her daughters, and it was called The Regimen of the Body. And it covered, it covered a lot of stuff with health stuff, but it also covered a lot of daily life things as well. And this was an extremely popular book, in that there are, I think, still like 70 copies or more today. There's a lot of copies still left because it was reproduced quite a bit. And there were illustrations at the start of each chapter, and that reflected the whatever topic that chapter was going to be on. And it gave various aspects and roles of leadership, caregiving, labor during the medieval period. It also showed women performing and receiving health care, like cupping. I think here we go. This one here's the cupping. So this illustration here is from the Regimen of the Body, and this one shows the cupping, the medical practice of cupping taking place. This image here shows women sifting through a grain, I think rice. And so it showed upper class women, it showed servants, it showed labor and everyday work. It also showed various health aspects, and also jobs such as making wine, managing livestock. It showed surgical treatment. It showed different like health things with surgical treatments, different types of food to eat if you're sick, as well as prayers. Here's another one that shows here. It shows women harvesting on a farm, right? So you get what's interesting with this is you get a depiction of the clothing. We get to see like the different types of clothing women wore, both in lower and upper class women. We also got to see the different types of jobs women had. And I think what was the expectations of a wealthy woman and household, right? The things that were there. One of the things I have it somewhere else. Let me see. Put it, here we go. These ones are from that too. This one was showing a man throwing up from drinking too much or being sick. Another one was beauty routines. And so you have the bottom one here was them giving a cream to put on the face for beauty routines. You have, you think of the elaborate and like beautiful nature of illuminated manuscripts. You don't usually think of one having an image of showing a man throwing up in it. But the idea was to highlight and show all these different ways that things that happen in life that you need to be aware of, and gave tips on how to do so with that. So it was like a manual for upper class women on that. Although it definitely could be a manual for middling group, lower class, if they had their own household. They may not have servants doing some of the work, but like the health section was super useful and helpful to have that information, tips on beauty regimens, and other things that way. But again, what you get from it is this elaborate kind of aspect of showing women in different jobs, women in different clothing, if you're a lower class or upper class. It also showed a wet nurse. So it showed a woman with her breast being inspected, because wet nurses, and then there's a whole chapter on like wet nurses and how to pick out a wet nurse, the importance of a wet nurse for the health of the baby. Wealthy, and this wasn't just here, this was a common practice in a lot of places too, is if you were wealthy enough, as a woman after you gave birth, you didn't actually breastfeed your own child, you had a wet nurse that did that for you. So a wet nurse is just someone who has also given birth but was considered lower class, and so then they would be brought in because they could not only feed their child but would feed then the noble family's child as well. And the other thing is that the women's work with illuminated manuscripts, expanded to a lot of different roles in society. In the secular aspects, I mentioned already that it served as schools for educating young women from wealthy families, which provided additional educational opportunities that otherwise were not there. The manuscripts and the convents where women would do all these records for keeping wills, deeds, and contracts. They were financial institutions for lending and investing, and the convents were all run by women doing this. It also showed they were employers of like craftsmen and artisans, to when they were building and expanding the convents and stuff like that. And then they also gave to the poor and provided a place for retirement. As I mentioned, Christine de Pizan retired to the Royal Abbey after her life as an author and scribe. And all of these roles and opportunities were connected to the convent and opened up, again, opportunities for women that they otherwise wouldn't have. So convents were religious in nature, and they were definitely connected, obviously, to religion, but they also served a very important secular focus for women as well, and produced many of these texts that give us a glimpse into showing what was like with the regimen of the body. It was what she basically, had a conversation with the convent about what she wanted in this book for her daughters, and then they put together essentially a whole collection of what was deemed important and valuable information to learn. Okay, so the next one here, look at developments in the later medieval period. The arrival of the observationist reform movement created a significant increase in women's scribal activities. In the first years after the house was reformed, by observant activities, the sisters worked to copy 27 large manuscripts, and specifically named 6 of the sisters who participated in this work. Right, so that's significant that they didn't just have a very they kind of almost immediately got to work after this. The observationist reform convents came into play. They didn't just keep doing what they're doing. They set out on a mission specifically to copy 27 large manuscripts, which maybe sometimes maybe not sound a lot if we think in terms of like books today. But to do the large, impressive manuscripts, like 27 is a lot. And the fact that then they actually named 6 of the women that were part of that is also significant, because, again, it wasn't common to always put the name of the author of manuscripts, both for men or women, into the text. There are lots of manuscripts that no one person, whether it was a man or a woman, were identified as the scribes or the illustrators. So they saw as important enough to have women's names be put into that to highlight their work and contribution to the illuminated manuscripts. And then during the start of the 14th century, book illustrations had largely actually shifted to secular topics. But obviously women's like cloisters and the nunneries still did produce choir books and other religious manuscripts, prayer books and things like that. But there is a huge increase in secular manuscripts at this time with the reform movement in that process. And this is one of the illustrations from the observationist reform movement that worked on those texts. And this one is religious in nature. So they didn't get rid of the religious texts. It just became way more popular to have other types of texts that were not just religious in nature. In the secular world, women trained as illustrators, so there was now an increase of women working as illustrators outside of the convent, which is important, right? That moves into the realm of professionalism. As much as the convents were essential and important to the development of women being part of this art form, to have it move to the secular world where that women were taking place in professional jobs as illustrators is a huge step in acceptability of women's labor in the world as in general. And so women learned these illustration skills within family workshops, continuing that artistic skill and tradition throughout the generations. We know of there was the daughters of the Nuremberg painter George Glockendon the Elder, or Janine de Montbaston, who illustrated copies of the lives of saints as well as secular manuscripts. And this is her work here. You can see the little miniatures and connected and reading to the border. So this one here, because these were more secular based, there was definitely ones that showed people in romantic situations, in this case embracing and looking like they're about to kiss. There were also other images of a man and woman like lying down in hay, implying that there was going to be some sexual relations at some point, or that it had already happened, and those type of images emerged with the shift to the secular workshop, right? And what's interesting is these women were essentially working and part of the like actual guilds and workshops and that were created and deemed as essentially professionals. Obviously, we've talked about this before. Daughters of prosperous painters, they did actually sometimes still join the convents to work on religious and secular manuscripts because it was still the easier way to go. But we see during this period a lot of daughters who had the leg up. If their fathers were already working in workshops, they could apprentice under their father. When there was still hesitation for women to work as apprentices if there wasn't a family connection, but the fact that it now had other opportunities outside of just the convent was a big thing in of itself, and allowed for increased opportunities for women. Secular women also began to own more and more manuscripts and books that included not only devotional texts, tracts, the Book of Hours, reflecting a whole bunch of different and varied interests. So the Book of Hours is almost kind of like a personal, not journal, but a book. Book of Hours were created for individuals, and it could have a variety of things. It could have parts of stories and information about their lives. It could have key important moments of things they did. It could have hymns or prayer devotionals, court rules, right? It depended on the individual person for that. But women more and more began to own manuscripts. And this is, I think, shown especially in that some women at court could write a bookhand, as called, paint and illuminate manuscripts on parchment, showcasing their talents. But the fact that you now had queens that had women at court with them that were there specifically to be scribes, to be illustrators, highlights the shift in acceptance of women and working within these positions, and it being seen as normal, not something that was just exclusively with the convents. But now the court had women, ladies in waiting, that were specifically there to be scribes, to be illustrators, which is significant. And another example is a wealthy widow. When she went to the convent, she brought with her 3 women that came with her who could copy, paint, and illuminate. And then she was given a stipend for her work. And that stipend then helped pay those 3 women that helped her create the books and the process of it. The Book of Hours of Margaret of Cleves was given to the Reformed cloister in 1409, which always taught it. This is actually a page from that book, the Book of Hours of Margaret Cleves, and it was super impressive. It was elaborate, tons of illustrations, and you can even see it in this painting here. Like the elaborate border and the designs, the gold that is used is bright and stands out. Just the combination of how much decoration, how much border, the illuminated letters and the illustrations, they're all exquisite and in significant detail. And it's often considered like one of the not just more elaborate books, but better illuminated manuscripts from that. And it contained the manuscript to this, the Book of Hours of Margaret of Cleves contained an inscription dedicating it to the cloister as a memorial for Margaret. And this was actually common. When women died, they would bequeath their illuminated manuscripts to other women, whether that was in the convent, the cloister, or family or friends. And women were able actually to create kind of a book collection from, these gifts or inheritance, I suppose. It was seen as an acceptable informal inheritance for women to gift these books, and seen as a way to continue passing on these collections that they worked really hard and spent quite a bit of money to collect and hold on to. So you can see in this picture here, like, right, you have the lots of illuminated letters, you have the borders, you have the elaborate Mary and Jesus with the gold, you have then also an illustration at the beginning of the text. It's so vibrant. A lot of the illuminated manuscripts are amazing to look at, but definitely, like, the Book of Hours of Margaret of Cleves was just exquisitely done in terms of the detail, to how long it would have taken to create that text was a lot. It was a lot. So a lot of effort and time went into the creation of that book. And so it was seen as important enough to then be donated so that it wouldn't get lost and it could continue on. All right, probably the most famous scribe known was Christine de Pizan. She was born in Italy and moved to Paris as a young child when her father accepted a court position for Charles V in France. After the death of her husband, she turned to writing to support herself and her 2 kids. And she became the most prolific author. It attracted tons of patronage from all around France, from the royal family, from nobility. She composed the text and then supervised the creation of the images and the whole production of the illuminated manuscripts. Many of her works were for, like I said, the royalty and the noble patronage. Her largest work was the 2-volume collection made for the Queen of France called The Book of the Queen. And this, you can see here, this is her. And she's holding on to the book. And she's gifting it. They're in the Queen's chambers. You can tell by the ladies in waiting and the elaborate bed with the top piece. And then this is the Queen here. And so, and I covered up everything, so we'll erase it for a second. But so here's the Queen, here's Christine de Pizan, and she's gifting the book. So this illustration was in the book, which was showing her giving the book to the Queen. And there are several portraits of her in illuminated manuscripts because, again, she was so prolific in her writing. She was seen as like the best author, essentially, which is why so many people were patrons of her work. This one here you can see, so again, this gives us a good idea. Look at the elaborate floral aspects of the border. And how much detail and fine detail go into it. And then you have the illuminated letters, and then we have the small miniature of her working on a desk or workshop, and she's clearly writing in a manuscript. This, her style of dress is pretty consistent. We saw it in the other one. She's wearing the exact same thing. This very bright blue dress, and then it's hard to see here. I'm going to go to the next one just so you can see it. This is one that's a little bit easier to see. You've got these like horned things, and then there's a veil that's going over it. So it looks like 2 cone shapes on her head. This was part of the style. You have the cones that were wire was used to hold them up, and the cloth that was draped over it. And that double horned headdress was a common head covering that aristocratic women wore. And you can see that. Again, this one's a little bit smaller, but I'll erase all of that. The Queen has it in a way more elaborate. Some of the other women in the room have it, and then she's wearing it as well. So the paintings in that here's the blue dress significance and stuff like that. These were, it was she intentionally was showcasing, highlighting her noble status, but also so her and her social rank with the dress and with the double horned like veil. But the dress being this vibrant blue was also intentional because it would have been extremely expensive. That ultramarine pigment came from lapis lazuli, which was at the time, it was something actually even Mesopotamians used lapis lazuli, but it was expensive. It had to be imported. It was expensive to use and to create the dye of that blue. So the fact that she's wearing this blue dress is highlighting her wealth. Her double-horned veil, headdress, headscarf is also indicating that her wealth as well. And then all of these images of her show her sitting and working on a manuscript in study and contemplation, or gifting to the queen and stuff like that, right? So here in her study, showing her working. It was intentionally meant to highlight her role as essentially a scholar, right? And there's also in this one, there's a little white dog. And while dogs are just cute in portraits in the medieval period and earlier periods in history, dog ownership was largely for the wealthy. Lower classes could not afford to pay what were seen as irrelevant expenses for a dog. But if you were of nobility and wealthy and you had extra funds, you could afford to support a dog. So anytime you see like dogs in ancient pictures next to someone, that often is meant to highlight their nobility status, their wealth, because it symbolizes that wealth. It also, dogs tended to symbolize that loyalty and companionship, because dogs were always connected to that as well. But again, you rarely see dogs being put next to images of lower class individuals because they couldn't afford to have a dog as a pet. Throughout her literary career, she wrote on a number of topics ranging from religion, politics, poetry, military tactics, and all of this just reflecting her intellectual scope and broad understanding of things and all the different genres that she was a part of. Her writings also were often connected and related to her struggles in her lifetime. She wrote about the deaths from the plague, civil wars, foreign occupation. So she definitely had a diverse portfolio of writings. She was knowledgeable in many different areas. It wasn't just in one style or type. And the illustrations of her continue to highlight and show her in these very respectable intellectual aspects. In one of the images, she is shown again sitting in this kind of, this is seen as like a scholar's chair, and she's talking to her son, either instructing him or just chatting with him. And here in this image that was in the manuscript, she's in this this kind of throne chair or scholar's chair, which was often meant for university professors. And how it was, they'd sit in this chair and then they'd have students that would be around them, and you'd have these intellectual debates to prove learning and wisdom. Well, Christine couldn't be part of the university. The fact that she was shown in this type of chair was meant to highlight that she was seen as a scholar. More importantly, you have these men here that seem to be listening to her as she is either reading from her manuscript or teaching from it. Again, super unique for the time. This is not the normal role of women in society at this time, but does show that women had the ability and potential to be super influential in the intellectual scene, as a scribe, as illustrators, with manuscripts being the kind of piece that bound them to that intellectual structure. So really, again, highlights, especially this one with her debating these men or reading her manuscript to these men and them listening and paying attention and being interested, along with her as a woman being in the scholar's chair rather than the men. huge, huge symbolism for the power and prestige that she had, for that to be shown. All right. One of the other things that women influenced massively was cultural transference and translation into vernacular languages. Right? Women played a super important role in the development of vernacular literature for the court and religious communities. So prior to women that were commissioning these books saying, we want this in the language I speak, a lot of illuminated manuscripts were done in Latin because that was the official language the church used. It was also the kind of official language that like universities and highly educated people used. It was totally gatekeeping that, though, because they knew that it excluded the common person who was literate and could read in the vernacular, vernacular meaning common language, right? That only the truly intellect and educated would know Latin, right? But it was intentionally exclusive, because most people, except for those that were going to university and were extremely highly educated, spoke Latin. But women more and more were patrons of and commissioning illuminated manuscripts, and they wanted it in a language they could read. And this then popularized having illuminated manuscripts in both religious and secular manuscripts in the vernacular, which then opened up and made the manuscripts and books even more popular in society at the time. So that's a huge deal in that sense. Women also collected a large number of books. Again, we talked through inheritance, through gifting. If you were wealthy and you could afford it, buying someone an illuminated manuscript was an amazing gift. But not only did they amass large collections of books, they often these collections ended up being used to serve a purpose of providing a level of prestige and authority on those subjects that they had. Right? It gave them this sense of intellectual gravitas, if you will, to say, I still think it does. If someone takes you into their home and they have a massive library, you're going to be impressed. And then you're going to wonder, did they read the books? And if they read the books, you're going to be even more impressed. And so having a library, but that's today, people get impressed with that. And books are so much cheaper and easier to acquire. To have a library of manuscripts, of illuminated manuscripts and stuff. And again, library is being a little bit generous in what we think of library today. But if you had a whole a whole bookshelf of manuscripts, that would be considered a library, because these were expensive. These were hard to get. They took years to complete sometimes, depending on the size. And so if you had multiple manuscripts, it not only gave you prestige just for owning them, but connected to this idea that you were intellectually sound, that you could read and utilize all of these manuscripts in that sense. The other thing, though, is that it allowed women to kind of provide cultural transfer of ideas and practices, because when women married, they moved into their husband's home, and often marriages were arranged mostly during this time. And so, like I said, when marrying or moving, they influenced societal ideals ideas, because when they got married and the marriage was arranged, this often meant that, specifically for wealthy noble women, they would move to a different country, or a far enough town away that when they would bring their books with them, and often that meant it was especially like royalty who married and went to different countries, but even, like I said, the upper nobility often went to different countries and stuff like that. And so you'd have it in a different language, and you would also have these books that talked about customs, religious beliefs, information that could potentially be new to the new area they were going, and then that was introduced to the ladies of the court, to other women that they met and had meals with and things like that. And all of that meant that it created a larger transference of cultural values and ideas that women were largely responsible for in disseminating that, which is really interesting in that sense. The other thing too is in Europe in the later period, and I think that's important to note, that these the illuminated manuscripts were seen as a highly valued form of art and supported by leading art patrons. It wasn't seen as something that was just a tool, but it was seen, even in this period, as an art form. Commercial book illustrators, instead of monks and nuns, began to be the main ones running businesses in Europe. While, of course, men still outnumbered women as painters and sculptors and scribes, they did exist in the late 13th and early 14th century and were increasing in numbers. The other thing that was a huge thing is that a French guild of female book illuminators emerged. Why this is so significant? Guild, in the medieval period, if you wanted to be like a professional craftsman or artisan or illuminator or scribe, when they moved to the secular, as we talked about, they started having book workshops and stuff that were secular owned. But you wanted to apprentice and learn the skills and be seen as a professional. You only would be checked off as a professional if you went through as an apprentice with a guild, and you paid your dues to the guild and all of that. Women were largely excluded from almost every single guild. But because of the popularity of the manuscripts, because women had been so involved with it throughout the years, as we've been talking about, in France, they opened up a female illuminators guild, which of course then gave women the opportunity to become professional illuminators, which is super important if you want to earn money and you want to be recognized as a professional within that field, not just someone who's a woman with a hobby. And so that was a huge deal when that opened up. And again, it didn't open up guilds for women for the most part, but it does show the power that the women had in illuminated manuscripts, that they ended up creating a female guild for illuminators. That wouldn't have happened if women weren't so intimately involved in not only the purchasing, but making and creating of these manuscripts. We have also, this is an example with Burgot, who was a female illustrator. It's a little hard to see. I couldn't find one that zoomed in. Maybe I should have tried to crop it, but you can see I really like you have the little miniature paintings at the bottom, and then this elaborate thorn floral design with like birds and other things in it. Again, it's this kind of, the text in the center is pretty simplistic with just a single illuminated letter, but you have such an elaborate border, and then the illustrations and designs at the bottom showcasing different scenes from the books, right? That definitely still took quite a bit of work, but also was seen as slightly more simplistic because these were now coming out of workshops. So she was the daughter of a painter, Jean Lenoir, who worked for elite patrons. And they had their own workshop, and they worked for French nobility and royalty. So they weren't always producing the most elaborate, like the convents. One of the things is they had time to do all these crazy elaborate, like, it's going to take us 3 years to do this book. And then the church's like, cool, we don't care, that's fine. But if you have a patron and people wanting to buy the illuminated manuscripts from you, they didn't want to wait that long. So you would do different techniques that would still have elaborate, beautiful imagery, but wasn't quite as complex and detailed as some of the other images I showed you that had all this gold leaf, super intricate backgrounds and miniature scenes and multiple illuminated letters and crazy borders, right? Instead, you do more on the border, which could be done faster, but still creating a kind of elaborate structure with these smaller little miniatures on the bottom. And that allowed you to produce and finish the manuscript faster than kind of the more elaborate ones that we already looked at and stuff like that. With Burgot, the daughter of Jean Lenoir, they worked on the Book of Hours for Yolande of Flanders in 1353, which is this example here that I had. And then she ended up moving to Paris and working for the King of France, as well as other high-ranking nobility at the time. And so once again, just another woman that was actively involved, but more specifically in the secular fashion. Christine de Pizan and Bourgault were both examples of secular illuminated manuscript workshops. Now, even though Christine ended up in a nunnery when she retired, after her husband had died and her sons were grown and stuff like that, and she was done and she retired, she was not producing at the height of her popularity and fame. She wasn't part of a convent, and she wasn't producing for them, right? She was independent. And this is definitely that transition as it moved to more and more women working in the secular workshops, being part of some of these guilds, mass producing books for patrons. Which again decreased some of the elaborate nature of the illustrations, but nonetheless are still really impressive. By the 15th century, women would appear even more and more active in the art of book paintings. The record of the Painters Guild showed that it did admit women on occasion, and in 1454 they had 12% of their members. So in 1454 in the guild, 12% were women. By 1480, you had 25% women. So you have from 1454 to 1480 a good sized increase in the number of women being part of this guild for illuminated manuscripts for illustrators. Wealthy women continued to look to participate in a variety of ways in the creation of these manuscripts, and that had, again, at one point largely been considered for men, not for women. And that has moved beyond just the church, which was a super important part of it to begin with, but now into the popular culture and secular world, which opened up the idea of professional illuminators, that women who could now make a living, not with the help of the convent, but just on their own through the work as an illustrator, as a scribe. And it opened up women's ability to increase their education, to learn information on new subjects, pass along cultural values, and instruction on whatever they deemed important and that they wanted to provide, which of course increases women's power and influence in that period on society. And this wasn't just for I would argue that what I was talking about there with, like I said, increasing education, the cultural values, learning new subjects, being able to pick what they thought was important. This was for both the women who were creating the illuminated manuscripts and the women who commissioned it. Because the women who commissioned these were commissioning more and more books than ever before by the 15th century. And they had a lot of creative control. If they're paying for the book, then you got to kind of determine what you wanted to go in it. And that the manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, gave women an opportunity to expand their knowledge, perfect a craft and art, be employed as artists, when in so many cases later on we'll see women struggled to be seen as professional artists later, but in the periods and stuff. And yet in this medieval period, because of the connection to specifically the illuminated manuscripts and the convents starting with this, it became an acceptable professional role for women very, very early on, when we'll see again, hundreds of years later, women were still struggling to be seen as professional artists. And yet in this niche area, women were seen as professional artists, as professional authors and artists of the illustrations, because of that development and growth and it being connected to women, it being an acceptable art form for women that was then beginning to be consumed and paid for by the public, not just the convents themselves. And that opened up a whole lot of opportunities for women. All right, that is where we will leave it for this week. I hope you have a good week.